This content is entirely fictional and does not promote violence, organized crime, or illegal activities. This story reflects the tragic consequences of involvement in the criminal world and the terrible price paid for illegitimate power. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of the Chicago Cultural Center like an omen, each droplet a tiny fist against the sacred walls. Catherine Reeves stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, staring at a woman she barely recognized. 29 years old, and the ivory dress hung on her frame like a shroud, expensive silk that someone else had chosen, someone else had paid for, someone else would remember wearing. Her reflection showed the truth she'd been avoiding for 3 months. Dark circles under green eyes that used to sparkle with ambition back at MIT. Back when her biggest concern was differential equations and load-bearing calculations, not medical bills and debt collectors, and the slow suffocation of choosing between dignity and survival. Her red hair, once her pride, now pulled back tight enough to hurt, severe enough to match the severity of what she was about to do. Marry a man she didn't love to save a brother she couldn't lose. The mathematics of desperation were simple. $180,000 in debt. Student loans from MIT that had seemed worth it when she believed the world rewarded intelligence and hard work. Medical bills from her mother's long-losing battle with alcoholism and grief. The funeral costs when she finally surrendered 3 years after Catherine's father died. And then Jake, her baby brother, 19 years old and brilliant and broken after the car accident that shattered his spine, and their last hope of normalcy. Preston Hallbrook had appeared like an answer to prayers she'd stopped saying. 35 years old, CEO of Hallbrook Development, with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and a philanthropy record that made him Chicago's golden boy. He'd walked into her office at Morrison Engineering 6 months ago with blueprints for Millennium Towers, a luxury high-rise that would reshape the skyline. 42 stories of glass and steel and ambition, the kind of project that could make a structural engineer's career. She'd noticed the irregularities immediately. Load calculations that didn't quite add up. Concrete specifications that seemed substandard for a building of that height. Steel grades that made her engineering instincts scream warnings. But Preston had smiled that sharp smile and told her not to worry, that his people had triple-checked everything, that she should focus on the aesthetic elements and leave the heavy lifting to the senior engineers. She should have walked away then, should have reported her concerns to the state licensing board, should have remembered that her father, Michael Reeves, had been a construction foreman who taught her that integrity wasn't negotiable, that cutting corners on buildings meant cutting short the lives of people who'd never know they were in danger until the floor gave way beneath them. But then Jake's accident happened, and the bills came, and Preston appeared at the hospital with flowers and concern and an offer that sounded like salvation. He'd pay everything, every penny of debt, give Jake the best rehabilitation money could buy, set Catherine up in a position where she'd never have to choose between rent and food again. All she had to do was marry him. The proposal had been as cold and transactional as a merger agreement. No pretense of love, no romance, just a business arrangement where she signed her life away in exchange for her brother's survival. Preston needed a wife, he'd explained, someone intelligent and accomplished to stand beside him at fundraisers and political events, someone who could make him look like more than just another trust fund developer playing at being a titan of industry. In return, she got financial security and the chance to keep the only family she had left. She'd said yes because what else could she say when the alternative was watching Jake's medical care get downgraded to whatever insurance would cover, watching physical therapy sessions get cut back, watching the light in his eyes dim as he realized his sister couldn't save him after all. 3 months of planning a wedding she didn't want to a man she didn't know. 3 months of telling herself it wouldn't be that bad, that people married for worse reasons, that maybe she could find some kind of peace in the transaction. 3 months of ignoring the voice in her head that sounded exactly like her father asking what happened to the girl who wanted to build things that would last, who wanted to leave the world stronger than she found it. That voice got louder 2 nights ago when she'd stayed late at the office, reviewing the Millennium Tower's blueprints one more time because something kept nagging at her engineer's brain, kept telling her to look deeper, to check her math again. And that's when she saw it. The signature at the bottom of the structural approval documents. Michael Reeves, professional engineer, license number 62041784. Her father's signature, his license number, his professional seal. Dated April 15th, 2013, 2 weeks before a construction site accident crushed him beneath a falling steel beam and turned her mother into a ghost who drank herself to death over 3 long years. Except her father had never worked on Millennium Towers. The project hadn't even been conceived in 2013. And when Catherine pulled the original documents from the city records database, cross-referencing timestamps and digital fingerprints, and all the forensic tools she'd learned in her materials science courses, she found the truth that made her blood run cold. The signature was forged, the approval was fabricated, and the building specifications were exactly the kind of corner-cutting negligence that her father would have died before signing off on. Substandard concrete that would develop microfractures under load. Steel reinforcement placed at intervals that violated every safety code in the International Building Code. Foundation work that assumed soil compression values that didn't match the geological surveys. Millennium Towers was a death trap waiting to happen. 5 years, maybe 7 if they got lucky with weather and seismic activity, and then the failure cascade would begin. Cracks in the facade, water intrusion compromising the concrete, steel corrosion accelerating in Chicago's freeze-thaw cycles. And one day, maybe during a thunderstorm or a particularly harsh winter, the building would give up its fight against gravity and 800 families, would learn that progress came with a price their children would pay in blood and rubble. Her father had known. That's what the evidence suggested when she dug deeper, when she hacked into archived email servers and found correspondence between Michael Reeves and Holbrook Development from March 2013. Her father had been hired as a quality control inspector on an early Holbrook project. He'd found the same pattern of fraud, the same material substitutions, the same criminal negligence disguised as cost optimization. He'd refused to sign off. He'd threatened to report Holbrook to the state licensing board. 2 weeks later, a loading crane malfunctioned at a Holbrook construction site. Safety inspections after the incident found nothing wrong with the equipment. The investigation concluded it was operator error, a tragic accident, no criminal liability. Michael Reeves was buried with full honors, remembered as a good man who died doing honest work. Except it wasn't an accident. Catherine knew that now. Knew it with the same certainty she knew that concrete compression strength decreased exponentially with water-cement ratio, that steel yield points were non-negotiable facts of material science, that some truths were written in physics and couldn't be argued away. Preston Holbrook had killed her father, and now he wanted to marry her. The door to the bridal suite opened without a knock. Preston walked in like he owned the room, which he probably did since he'd paid for the entire venue. He looked perfect in his charcoal suit, hair styled with the kind of precision that required a personal barber, smile calibrated to inspire confidence in investors and voters and women who didn't know better. 35 years old and already being mentioned as a future mayoral candidate, a man who'd inherited his father's real estate empire and quintupled it through aggressive development deals and political connections that would make organized crime look amateur. Catherine turned from the mirror, clutching the small clutch purse that held the USB drive. 3 gigabytes of evidence. Forged documents, email trails, structural analysis proving fraud, financial records showing systematic material substitution across 7 Holbrook development properties. Everything she'd compiled over 2 sleepless nights, knowing that once she took this step, there was no going back. "You look beautiful," Preston said, and his voice had all the warmth of a contract negotiation. "Ready." She studied his face, looking for some sign of humanity, some indication that the man who'd proposed to her with a prenuptial agreement thicker than a phone book might feel even a flicker of conscience about what he'd done. But Preston Hallbrook's eyes were the blue of a winter sky, cold and empty and infinite. "I need to use the restroom," she said. 5 minutes. "We're already running late. The efficient is waiting." 5 minutes, Preston. I think you can give your bride 5 minutes. Something flickered across his face then, annoyance or calculation, but he nodded. 5 minutes. Don't make me come looking for you. He left, and Catherine waited until his footsteps faded down the marble corridor before moving. The cultural center was a maze of Gilded Age opulence, all Tiffany glass and mosaic floors and rooms that echoed with the ghosts of a Chicago that used to build things meant to last. She bypassed the restroom, heading instead toward the service stairwell that led to the loading dock. She'd planned this part carefully. Not an escape, not yet, just reconnaissance. She needed to know if Preston suspected anything, needed to gauge how much danger she was actually in before she decided whether to go through with the wedding and destroy him from the inside or run now, and take her chances with whatever protection the evidence might buy her. The service corridor was empty, dim lighting and concrete walls that absorbed sound like a confession booth. She could hear music drifting from the ceremony hall, classical guitar doing its best to make a business transaction sound like true love. 200 guests waiting to witness a lie, most of them Preston's business associates and political connections, people who measured worth in zeros after the first digit and wouldn't notice or care that the bride looked like she was walking to her execution. That's when she heard the voices. Preston's distinctive tenor, sharp-edged even when he was trying to sound casual, drifting from an alcove near the loading dock entrance. And another voice, deeper, unfamiliar, responding in tones too low for her to make out words. Catherine pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, engineer's instincts telling her that the angle of the alcove would hide her from view if she stayed perfectly still. "The honeymoon paperwork is ready," Preston was saying. "Once we're in Turks and Caicos, she'll sign the transfer documents. Property deeds, intellectual property rights, power of attorney for the trust that holds her father's old assets. She has no idea what she's signing over. And if she figures it out," the other voice cautious, professionally paranoid. "She won't. Catherine's smart, but she's desperate. Desperation makes people blind to patterns. Besides, by the time we're back from the honeymoon, the Millennium permits will be approved and construction will be too far along to stop. The woman knows structural engineering. What if she realizes?" Preston laughed, and the sound had all the humanity of a bank foreclosure notice. "Then we handle it the same way we handled her father. Accidents happen on construction sites all the time. OSHA will investigate, find nothing wrong, and the project continues. The only difference is this time I'll own everything she ever cared about, including the brother. No loose ends." Catherine's vision narrowed to a pinpoint. The USB drive in her clutch suddenly felt radioactive. 3 gigabytes of evidence against a man who just casually discussed murdering her the same way he'd murdered her father. The mathematics shifted again, desperation replaced by a colder calculation. If she went through with this wedding, she was signing her own death warrant. If she ran, Preston would hunt her, use Jake as leverage, make sure she disappeared without ever exposing what she knew. Unless she could find someone more dangerous than Preston Hallbrook to stand between her and oblivion. The ceremony music changed, shifted to something more urgent. Someone would come looking for her soon. She had maybe 3 minutes before Preston realized his bride had gone missing and locked down the building. 3 minutes to make a choice that would define whether she survived the night or became another tragic accident in the Hallbrook development legacy. Catherine ran. Not toward the ceremony hall where 200 people waited to witness a lie, but toward the loading dock exit, toward the rain-hammered streets of Chicago, and whatever desperate chance at survival existed beyond the reach of Preston Hallbrook's money and connections and casual willingness to kill anyone who threatened his empire. The rain hit her like a baptism when she burst through the exit, cold April rain that soaked through expensive silk in seconds and made the wedding dress cling to her skin like it was trying to drag her down. No coat, no umbrella, just a clutch purse with evidence of murder and fraud, and a systematic conspiracy to build death traps disguised as luxury housing. Michigan Avenue at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday looked like something from a noir film, all neon reflections on wet pavement and brake lights bleeding red into the storm. Catherine ran, heels clicking against concrete until she kicked them off and kept going barefoot, white dress billowing behind her like a flag of surrender or maybe defiance. She couldn't tell which anymore. Behind her, she heard shouting. Preston's voice cutting through the rain, calling her name with an edge of panic that probably had more to do with losing control of his narrative than any actual concern for her well-being. She didn't look back. Looking back was for people who still had choices. The intersection ahead showed red, traffic backed up in both directions. Catherine calculated distances and speeds with the same precision she used for load-bearing analysis, saw the gap closing, knew she had maybe 30 seconds before Preston, and whoever he'd brought with him caught up and dragged her back to finish the ceremony or finish her, whichever served his purposes better. That's when she saw the car. Black Mercedes S-Class, idling at the curb outside the Palmer House Hotel, engine running and windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever waited inside. Expensive enough to belong to someone important, positioned carefully enough to suggest the driver was waiting for someone specific. Catherine made a decision based purely on mathematics. The probability of survival if she let Preston catch her, 0%. The probability of survival if she threw herself on the mercy of a complete stranger, unknown but greater than 0. She yanked open the rear passenger door and threw herself inside, wedding dress and rain water and desperation, all tumbling into leather seats that probably cost more than her first car. "Drive," she gasped, slamming the door behind her. "Please, just drive, they're going to kill me." The interior of the Mercedes was dark, climate-controlled, smelling faintly of expensive cologne, and something else. Something that made her engineer's brain catalog it as danger even before her eyes adjusted enough to see the man in the driver's seat. He was turned halfway around, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting casually on the center console in a way that suggested he could access whatever weapon was probably hidden there faster than she could apologize for her mistake. "Lady," he said, and his voice had an accent she couldn't quite place, something European under the American English. "This isn't a taxi." "I don't care what it is." Catherine's voice broke on the words, 3 months of holding herself together finally cracking under the weight of everything she'd learned and everything she'd lost. "I have evidence of murder and construction fraud, and they're going to kill me if you don't drive right now." The man studied her with eyes that caught the streetlight, gray like smoke or gunmetal or a sky before it opened up and drowned everything beneath it. He was maybe late 30s, dark hair styled with casual precision, features that would have been handsome in a classical sense if not for the hardness in his expression, the kind of face that had seen enough violence to become fluent in it. "Catherine Reeves," he said, and her blood turned to ice. 29 years old, structural engineer at Morrison Engineering, MIT graduate, summa cum laude, $180,000 in debt. Father Michael Reeves died in construction accident April 2013. Brother Jake Reeves, 19, recovering from spinal injury at Northwestern Memorial. currently scheduled to marry Preston Holbrook in approximately 7 minutes. She stopped breathing. The kind of dossier he'd just recited didn't come from casual research. This was intelligence work, the kind of deep background check that suggested whoever was sitting in the driver's seat had resources that made internet searches look like phone books. "Who are you?" Her hand moved to the door handle, calculating whether she could run again, where she could run to, whether there was anywhere in Chicago that Preston's money or this stranger's information network couldn't reach. The man's expression didn't change. "My name is Nikolai Volkov, and you just climbed into the car of the head of the largest Russian organized crime family in the Midwest." Catherine's engineering brain tried to process this new variable, slot it into the equation of her rapidly deteriorating situation, but the mathematics had gotten too complex. She'd fled from a murderer who built death traps and married his victims, and landed in the back seat of a man who probably had a body count that made Preston look like an amateur. Nikolai watched her process this, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You're wondering if you just made your situation worse." The thought had crossed my mind. "Depends on your perspective." He shifted in his seat, and Catherine noticed the way he moved, economical and precise, like violence was a language he spoke fluently enough not to waste words. "Preston Holbrook wants you dead or married, probably both in that order. I just want to know why you ran." Catherine's hand tightened on the clutch purse. The USB drive inside suddenly felt like either a bargaining chip or a death sentence, depending on whether Nikolai Volkov was the kind of criminal who respected evidence or the kind who eliminated witnesses. "I found proof," she said, because what did she have to lose at this point except the truth? Proof that Preston murdered my father. Proof that he's been building structurally unsound buildings across Chicago for the past decade. Proof that Millennium Towers is going to collapse and kill 800 people unless someone stops him. Nikolai's expression shifted, something calculating replacing the casual threat. The Millennium Towers project. 42 stories, mixed-use development, breaking ground next month pending final permits. "You know about it." "I make it my business to know about every major development project in Chicago, especially ones being built on property that used to belong to my organization." Catherine's engineer brain finally caught up, slotted this new information into place with a click of recognition that felt like a door slamming shut. "You're saying Millennium Towers is being built on your land." Was my land. Until 6 months ago when someone used forged property deeds to transfer ownership to a shell corporation that happens to be controlled by Holbrook Development. I've been investigating the theft, trying to figure out Preston's angle. He paused, studied Catherine with new interest. And then 3 months ago, he suddenly announces his engagement to a structural engineer with access to all his building plans. "I didn't know," Catherine said, but even as she said it, she realized how naive that sounded. She'd been so focused on surviving, on saving Jake, that she hadn't stopped to ask why Preston Holbrook would choose her out of all the women in Chicago to be his convenient wife. No, Nikolai agreed, but Preston did. He needed someone who could validate his building plans, give them professional credibility. And he needed someone desperate enough not to ask too many questions. You were perfect. Smart enough to be useful, desperate enough to be controlled. Through the tinted windows, Catherine could see figures emerging from the cultural center. Preston, his best man, security personnel fanning out across Michigan Avenue, with the kind of coordination that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd hunted someone through downtown Chicago. Nikolai saw them too. "You have maybe 2 minutes before they check every car on this block, so I'll ask you once more. What exactly did you find?" Catherine made the calculation. Trust a murderer she knew or a criminal she didn't. The mathematics were simple. Preston wanted her dead. Nikolai just wanted information. And in the hierarchy of threats, information seemed like something she could trade for survival. She pulled the USB drive from her clutch, held it up in the dim interior light. Forged documents using my father's signature and engineering license. Financial records showing systematic material, fraud across 7 Holbrook projects. Email evidence that Preston ordered my father killed when he refused to sign off on substandard construction. And structural analysis proving that Millennium Towers is a death trap that will collapse within 5 to 7 years. Nikolai's eyes fixed on the drive with the intensity of a predator spotting wounded prey. May I? Catherine handed it over, watched him plug it into a tablet that emerged from the center console. The screen illuminated his face in blue-white light as he scrolled through files, his expression unreadable, but his fingers moving with the speed of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. The silence stretched while Preston's people moved closer, checking cars systematically. Catherine could hear radios crackling, voices coordinating a search grid that would reach them in less than a minute. "This is good," Nikolai finally said, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect or might have been satisfaction. Catherine couldn't tell which. Better than good. This is enough to destroy Preston Holbrook and everyone connected to his operation. Then give it to the FBI. Nikolai looked at her, and his expression suggested she'd just said something incredibly naive. The FBI has 3 agents on Preston's payroll. The Chicago PD has an entire unit. The Cook County building inspectors who should have caught these violations years ago are either incompetent or complicit. You go to the authorities with this evidence, and you'll be dead within 24 hours. They'll call it suicide, depression over a failed wedding, and Preston will rebuild his reputation at your funeral. Then what am I supposed to do? Nikolai put the car in gear. Right now, you're supposed to hold on. He pulled away from the curb with the kind of smooth acceleration that came from driving expensive machinery like it was an extension of your nervous system. The Mercedes slipped into traffic 3 cars ahead of where Preston's security team was conducting their search, blending into the flow of vehicles heading north on Michigan Avenue. Catherine twisted in her seat, watched through the rear window as Preston appeared on the sidewalk, phone to his ear, his perfect facade finally cracking enough to show the rage underneath. For 3 months, she'd told herself he was just a businessman who married for convenience, that she could survive being Mrs. Holbrook if it meant keeping Jake alive and healthy. Now she knew the truth. Preston Holbrook was a killer who built monuments to his own greed and called them luxury housing. And she'd almost let him trap her in a marriage that would have ended with her body at the bottom of a construction site accident report. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." Nikolai navigated through traffic with the confidence of someone who'd driven these streets enough times to know every shortcut and back alley. "Somewhere Preston's people won't look. Somewhere we can talk about what happens next." "And what does happen next?" Nikolai glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and Catherine saw something in his expression that made her realize she'd just asked the wrong question. Or maybe the right question, depending on how you defined survival. "Next," he said, "we figure out if you're brave enough to do what it takes to stop a man like Preston Holbrook. Because going to the authorities won't work. Running won't work. The only way you survive this is if you fight back with the same tools he's using." "You mean crime?" "I mean pragmatism. Preston operates in the shadows between legal and illegal, uses the system to protect himself while he builds death traps and murders anyone who threatens to expose him. You can't fight that with evidence and good intentions. You need leverage. You need resources. You need people who understand how the real game is played. And you have all those things." Nikolai's smile was sharp enough to cut. "I have a very specific set of resources, yes. And right now, you have information I need. Preston stole property from my organization. He's building on land that belongs to me. That makes this personal, so I'll offer you a deal." Catherine's father had taught her that deals with criminals never ended well. But her father had also taught her that structural integrity was non-negotiable, and look where standing on principle had gotten him. Sometimes survival required compromise. Sometimes the only way to build something that lasted was to start with a foundation that wasn't entirely clean. "What kind of deal?" "You help me destroy Preston Holbrook and everyone connected to his operation. I keep you alive long enough to see it happen. After that, you disappear. New identity, new city, new life. Your brother gets the medical care he needs and never knows how close he came to losing his sister." "And if I say no?" "Then I drop you off at the next corner and you take your chances with Preston's people. They're good at making problems disappear. I'd give you maybe 6 hours before they find you." The Merceds turned onto Lake Shore Drive, the city lights reflecting off the lake like fallen stars. Catherine looked out at Chicago, the skyline she dreamed of reshaping with buildings that would stand for 100 years, monuments to engineering excellence and architectural vision. Instead, she discovered that the city was full of towers built on lies, foundations poured with greed instead of concrete, structures held together by corruption instead of steel. My father always said that cutting corners on buildings was the same as cutting throats. The failures just took longer to bleed out. "Your father was a smart man," Nikolai said. "That's why Preston killed him." Catherine closed her eyes, felt the USB drive's absence in her clutch like a phantom limb. She'd handed over the only leverage she had to a man who ran a criminal organization, fled from one monster into the car of another, all because the mathematics of desperation had left her with no good options. But maybe there were no good options anymore. Maybe there were only choices between different kinds of damage, different prices to pay for survival. Her father had chosen integrity and died for it. Her mother had chosen grief and drowned in it. Catherine could choose to run and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, or she could choose to fight back with whatever weapons she could find, even if those weapons came with a Russian accent and a body count. The car accelerated, merging into the late-night traffic that flowed along the lake like blood through arteries. Somewhere behind them, Preston Holbrook was mobilizing his resources, calling in favors from politicians and police, and whoever else he kept on retainer for situations exactly like this. Somewhere ahead, in a city that suddenly felt more dangerous than she'd ever imagined, there might be a chance at something that looked like justice if you squinted hard enough and didn't think too carefully about the methods. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Nikolai checked his mirrors, a gesture so casual it took Catherine a moment to realize he was checking for pursuit, calculating threat levels, and escape routes with the same unconscious precision she used when analyzing structural loads. "You decided the moment you got in my car," he said. "Now we just figure out if you're strong enough to live with that decision." The rain continued to fall, washing Chicago clean in that temporary way rain always did, giving the city a fresh coat of shine that would last until morning, when the dirt and corruption rose back to the surface. Catherine watched the water streak across the windows and thought about her father, about the last time she'd seen him alive, the morning he'd left for the construction site that would become his grave. He'd kissed her forehead and told her to always build things that would last, to never compromise on the foundations, because everything else depended on getting that part right. She'd failed him by being desperate enough to almost marry his killer, failed him by not seeing the pattern earlier, by not asking the hard questions when she first noticed the irregularities in Preston's designs. But maybe she could still honor his memory by making sure no one else died because of Preston Holbrook's greed, even if it meant partnering with a criminal, even if it meant becoming someone her father might not recognize. "I'm strong enough," she said, and heard the lie in her voice, but said it anyway because sometimes you had to fake structural integrity until the real thing had time to set. Nikolai's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, and something passed between them, an understanding or maybe just a mutual recognition that they were both survivors who'd learned to do whatever it took to stay alive in a city that ate the weak and celebrated the ruthless. "Good," he said, "because this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Preston won't stop until you're dead or he is. And the people he works with, the network he's built, they have resources that make my organization look like amateurs. Then why help me? Because Preston Holbrook stole from me. He used forged documents to take property my family has owned for 20 years. He thinks he can operate in my city, on my territory, without consequences." Nikolai's voice dropped, and Catherine heard the steel underneath the civilized accent. "And because when I destroy someone, I like to use their own weapons against them. You're going to help me do that." The Merceds turned off Lake Shore Drive, heading into a neighborhood Catherine didn't recognize. Upscale, quiet, the kind of place where people paid for privacy and got it. Nikolai pulled into an underground garage beneath a building that looked like it belonged in a design magazine, all glass and steel and modern lines that suggested someone had spent serious money on architectural vision. "Welcome to your new temporary home," he said, killing the engine. "Top floor, penthouse, security on every entrance. Preston's people won't find you here. And if they do, then we'll find out if you're as good at structural analysis under pressure as your MIT transcripts suggest." Nikolai opened his door, paused before getting out. "One more thing, Catherine. The moment you got in my car, you became part of this war whether you wanted to or not. Preston will come for you. His associates will come for you. The only question is whether you're going to face them as a victim or as someone who fights back." Catherine looked down at her ruined wedding dress, silk stained with rain and regret, a costume for a role she'd almost played until the final curtain. Then she looked up at Nikolai Volkov, at the man who just offered her a choice between running and standing her ground, between being hunted and becoming something that could hunt back. The mathematics had simplified. Preston Holbrook had killed her father, stolen her family's legacy, and tried to trap her in a marriage that would have ended with her death. The FBI couldn't help her. The police couldn't help her. The legal system that should have caught Preston's fraud years ago had failed. Which left her with a Russian crime boss and a USB drive full of evidence, and the kind of rage that came from finally understanding how thoroughly she'd been played. "I'll fight," she said, and this time it wasn't a lie. Nikolai smiled, and there was nothing warm in it, just the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd just recruited an ally for a war that had been brewing since the moment Preston Holbrook decided he could steal with impunity. "Then let's go to work," he said. "We have a lot to discuss and not much time. Preston will realize what you took from him by morning. When he does, Chicago is going to become a very dangerous place for both of us." They rode the elevator in silence, Catherine's bare feet leaving wet prints on marble floors, her wedding dress dripping water that would probably stain. The penthouse when they reached it was exactly what she'd expected, expensive and cold and perfect, the kind of space that looked designed by professionals who'd never actually lived in it. But Catherine wasn't looking at the decor. She was looking at the wall of windows that showed Chicago spread out below like a circuit board, all lights and connections, and power flowing through channels that most people never saw. Somewhere in that sprawl of steel and concrete, Preston Holbrook was planning his next move. Somewhere, her brother was sleeping in a hospital bed, unaware that his sister had just committed herself to a war she might not survive. And somewhere, built or being built on fraudulent permits and forged approvals, 7 buildings stood waiting to fail, waiting to collapse and take innocent people down into rubble and ruin, because one man had decided profit mattered more than lives. Catherine turned away from the windows, turned toward Nikolai Volkov, who was watching her with those gunmetal eyes, calculating whether she was an asset or a liability, whether she'd break under pressure or become something useful. "Tell me everything," she said. "Everything about Preston, about the consortium you mentioned, about what we're really up against. Because if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to help you destroy him, I need to understand the whole structure. Every load-bearing element, every weak point, every place where the right amount of pressure will bring the whole thing down." Nikolai's smile widened, and for the first time since she'd thrown herself into his car, Catherine saw something in his expression that might have been respect. "Now you're thinking like an engineer," he said. "Good, because what we're about to do requires precision. One mistake and we both end up buried under the same rubble as everyone else Preston has destroyed." He moved to a desk, pulled out a tablet, began calling up files and photographs and documentation that painted a picture far more complex and terrifying than Catherine had imagined. And as the rain continued to fall outside, washing Chicago clean in that temporary, impossible way, Catherine Reeves stood in a criminal's penthouse and learned exactly what she'd gotten herself into. The real story was just beginning, and by the time it ended, either Preston Holbrook would be destroyed or Catherine would be dead. There was no third option. The mathematics were that simple, and that absolute. This content is entirely fictional and does not promote violence, organized crime, or illegal activities. This story reflects the tragic consequences of involvement in the criminal world and the terrible price paid for illegitimate power. The first light of Wednesday morning came through the penthouse windows like an accusation, turning Chicago's skyline from noir shadow into harsh geometry. Catherine had not slept. How could she, standing in the pristine kitchen of a Russian crime boss's fortress, drinking coffee that probably cost more per pound than her monthly grocery budget, watching the city wake up to a day that would mark her as either a fugitive or a corpse depending on how the next few hours played out? Nikolai had disappeared around 3 a.m., muttering something about securing perimeters and making arrangements, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the kind of silence that amplified every doubt she'd been trying to suppress. The wedding dress lay in a sodden heap in the bathroom where she'd finally peeled it off, replaced by clothes that had appeared in the guest room as if by magic. Jeans that fit perfectly, a black sweater, sneakers in her exact size. The efficiency of it was almost more frightening than the surveillance it implied. She'd spent the dark hours reviewing everything Nikolai had shown her before he left. The tablet he'd given her was loaded with files that painted a picture far more complex than simple real estate fraud. Preston Holbrook wasn't just a corrupt developer. He was the public face of something called the Consortium, an alliance of 3 separate criminal organizations that had found more profit in cooperation than competition. The Irish mob controlled the labor unions, ensuring that construction projects used their workers and paid their rates. The Italian families controlled the city inspectors and permits, making sure nothing got built without their approval. And the Russian Bratva, Nikolai's organization, had controlled the land and materials, the foundational elements that made development possible in the first place. Past tense, had controlled, because 18 months ago, someone had started systematically stealing from the Russians. Property deeds forged and filed with the county clerk. Shipping manifests altered to redirect construction materials. Bank accounts drained through shell companies that existed only long enough to launder money before dissolving into paperwork so complex that tracing it would take years. Preston Holbrook had orchestrated it all, playing the 3 families against each other while positioning himself as the legitimate businessman who could unite their interests under legal cover. The Millennium Towers project was supposed to be the proof of concept, the first of a dozen planned developments that would cement the consortium's control over Chicago's construction industry for the next generation. Except Preston had gotten greedy. Instead of building legitimate structures that would last and generate steady income, he'd cut corners, substituted materials, created buildings designed to fail at precisely calculated intervals. The insurance payouts would be massive. The reconstruction contracts would go to consortium companies. It was a perpetual money machine built on the corpses of people who'd never know they were living in tombs with delayed timers. Catherine's engineer brain kept circling back to the same horrifying conclusion. 800 families in Millennium Towers alone. Another 3,000 across the 6 other projects. Children sleeping in bedrooms that would become coffins. Parents coming home from work to buildings that would pancake in progressive collapse, floor by floor, because some sociopath had decided that proper concrete would cut too deeply into his profit margins. The sound of the elevator arriving pulled her from her calculations. Nikolai emerged, and Catherine noticed for the first time that he moved with the kind of controlled economy that came from military training. No wasted motion, every step deliberate. The kind of body awareness that separated trained killers from street thugs. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Same clothes from last night, though somehow still crisp and clean. Hair still perfect. But there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, stress showing through the carefully maintained facade. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Preston filed a police report 3 hours ago. You're officially a kidnapping victim. FBI is involved. They're treating this as a potential organized crime abduction." Catherine set down her coffee cup with hands that wanted to shake, but refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Of course he did. Preston controls half the cops in this city. Not half. Nikolai moved to the windows, stood with his back to her in a way that suggested he was used to people not trying to attack him from behind. But enough. And the ones he doesn't control, the honest ones, they're going to be looking for you too. Which means we need to move faster than I'd planned. Move on what? Finding your brother before Preston does. The words hit Catherine like a physical impact, coffee forgotten. Fear she'd been suppressing suddenly flooding through her nervous system with the efficiency of poison. Jake. In his hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial, recovering from spinal surgery, surrounded by nurses and doctors and security that suddenly seemed completely inadequate against a man who could make construction accidents look natural. Jake's still in the hospital. Preston wouldn't. Preston already has. Nikolai turned, and his expression carried the kind of grim certainty that came from experience with men like Holbrook. "My people at Northwestern report that a private ambulance company tried to check your brother out of the facility at 4:30 this morning. Said they were transferring him to a rehabilitation center in Wisconsin. Better facilities, they claimed, fully paid for by an anonymous benefactor. But the transfer was fake. The rehabilitation center doesn't exist. The ambulance company is a shell corporation registered 6 days ago." Nikolai pulled out his phone, showed her a grainy security photo of 2 men in paramedic uniforms wheeling a gurney through a hospital corridor. These aren't medical professionals. They're contractors. The kind Preston uses when he needs something handled quietly. Catherine's engineering mind tried to calculate the forces at play, tried to find the structural weak point in Preston's plan, but the math kept dissolving into images of Jake. Her baby brother, 19 years old and helpless in a wheelchair, being taken to some anonymous location where accidents happened and bodies disappeared. Did they get him? Her voice came out steadier than she felt, engineer's discipline overriding panic. Is Jake safe? For now, Nikolai pocketed his phone. Northwestern's actual security stopped the transfer when the paperwork didn't match their records. But Preston will try again. He knows Jake is leverage. The only question is whether he's willing to hurt the brother to control the sister, or if he'll wait until he has you both before he starts making examples. Then we get Jake out of there. Move him somewhere Preston can't reach. already arranged. Nikolai checked his watch, and Catherine noticed it was something expensive and understated, the kind of timepiece that cost more than most cars but didn't advertise the fact. My people are moving him to a private facility in Michigan as we speak. Former military hospital, now run by a doctor who understands discretion. He'll have better care than Northwestern can provide, and security that actually knows what they're doing. Catherine wanted to feel grateful, wanted to accept this help at face value, but her father had taught her that nothing came without a price, especially from people who dealt in violence and leverage. What do you want in return? The same thing I wanted last night. Your help destroying Preston Holbrook and everyone connected to his operation. Nikolai moved to the kitchen, poured himself coffee with the casual ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in this exact space. But now the stakes are higher. Preston's not just stealing my property anymore. He's using the consortium's resources to build death traps, and some of those buildings are on land my family has owned for 2 decades. When they collapse, when people die, the lawsuits will target the property owners. Which means Preston's not just stealing from me, he's setting me up to take the fall for his murders. So this is about protecting yourself. This is about destroying a man who thinks he's smart enough to play 3 crime families against each other while building monuments to his own greed. Nikolai's voice carried an edge now, anger showing through the controlled facade. I've spent 8 years trying to turn my organization legitimate. Clean businesses, legal operations, moving away from the violence my father's generation used like a calling card. Preston Holbrook is threatening to drag me back into the old ways, into a war that will leave bodies in the streets and give the FBI exactly the excuse they need to dismantle everything I've built. Catherine studied him over her coffee, trying to reconcile the contradiction. A crime boss who wanted to go legitimate. A killer trying to build something clean. The mathematics didn't quite work, like trying to calculate load-bearing capacity with variables that kept changing value. You're still a criminal, she said, because someone needed to state the obvious. You run an organization built on extortion and smuggling, and probably a dozen other things I don't want to know about. Why should I trust that you're any better than Preston? Nikolai met her gaze, and for a moment Catherine saw something in his eyes that might have been honesty or might have been a very sophisticated lie. I never said I was better. I said I was necessary. Preston operates in the gray area between legal and illegal, uses the system to protect himself while he destroys lives. You can't fight that with evidence and good intentions. The FBI won't help you because he owns too many of them. The police won't help you because the ones he doesn't own are too scared to move against him. That leaves you with me. And if I help you, if we destroy Preston, what happens after? Do I just trade one criminal master for another? After this is over, you disappear. New identity, new city, fresh start. I keep my word, Catherine. It's one of the few luxuries I can still afford in this business. The elevator chimed again before Catherine could respond. Nikolai's hand moved to the weapon she'd known was there, hidden beneath his jacket, a movement so fast and practiced that it confirmed every suspicion she'd had about the kind of man she was dealing with. But the woman who emerged was not a threat, at least not in the conventional sense. 34 years old with dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, eyes that cataloged the room with the efficiency of a security assessment. She moved like Nikolai did, trained and dangerous, wearing business casual clothes that couldn't quite hide the athletic build underneath. "This is Irina," Nikolai said, and his voice carried an odd note that Catherine couldn't quite identify. "My sister, brigadier in the organization." Irina's eyes fixed on Catherine with the kind of cold evaluation that made her feel like a structural defect being identified for elimination. "So this is the bride who jumped into your car. She doesn't look like much." Appearances can be deceiving. Nikolai's tone suggested this was not the first time he'd had to defend a decision to his sister. Catherine has information that can destroy the consortium and everyone connected to it. She's more valuable than she looks. Information Preston Hallbrook will kill her for. Irina moved into the kitchen, poured coffee without asking permission, the kind of territorial behavior that marked this as her space as much as Nikolai's. Which makes her a target. Which makes everyone around her a target. Did you think about that before you brought her here, brother? I thought about getting her out of a situation where she'd be dead within hours. Nikolai's voice carried warning now, the kind of edge that suggested sibling relationships in criminal organizations had their own complicated dynamics. Preston is our enemy. Catherine's evidence gives us leverage against him. The mathematics are simple. Mathematics. Irina's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You sound like our father. Always calculating, always planning, never considering that some problems can't be solved with strategy and patience. Preston Hallbrook has stolen from us for 18 months. He's made us look weak in front of the other families. And your solution is to babysit his runaway bride and hope her engineering blueprints are enough to bring him down. The tension in the room shifted, became something more dangerous than Catherine had anticipated. She'd assumed Nikolai's biggest problem was Preston, but watching the way Irina stood, the way her hand rested casually near her own concealed weapon, Catherine realized she was watching a power struggle play out in real time. What would you suggest? Nikolai's question carried the weight of challenge. Direct action. Hit Preston's operations. Warehouse fires, shipment seizures, contractor incidents. Irina's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Show the consortium that stealing from the Volkov family has consequences. Remind Chicago who actually runs this city. And start a war that will bring federal attention and destroy everything I've built in the process. What you've built is weakness disguised as progress. Irina set down her coffee with controlled violence, the cup clicking against marble like a gunshot. Father and Alexei would be ashamed of what you've turned this organization into. Legitimate businesses and clean operations. You've forgotten what we are. I've forgotten nothing. Nikolai's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper Catherine was learning to recognize as his most lethal tone. I remember watching our father die because he couldn't adapt to a changing world. I remember Alex getting killed because he was too proud to compromise. I will not make their mistakes. Then you've already lost. Irina turned toward the elevator, paused before entering. The council is meeting tomorrow night. They want to discuss the Preston situation. They want to vote on leadership. I suggest you have better answers than babysitting engineers and playing detective with stolen files. The elevator doors closed on whatever response Nikolai might have made. Catherine watched the numbers descend, each floor a countdown to some confrontation she didn't fully understand, but knew would have implications for her own survival. Your sister wants you dead, she said, because sometimes stating the obvious was the only way to process information that didn't fit into engineering equations. My sister wants what she's always wanted, power without responsibility, strength without strategy. Nikolai moved back to the windows, and Catherine noticed the way he positioned himself to watch both the elevator and the entrance, never fully relaxed, always calculating angles of attack. She thinks the old ways were better. Violence and intimidation instead of patience and planning. She doesn't understand that the world has changed. Or maybe she understands that your world is about to change, whether you want it to or not. Nikolai turned, studied Catherine with an intensity that made her want to step back. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. Most people in your situation would be falling apart. But you're analyzing, calculating, looking for the structural weaknesses in every situation. MIT trained me to solve problems. This is just a problem with higher stakes than usual. This isn't a problem you can solve with mathematics, Catherine. This is a war, and wars are won by whoever's willing to pay the highest price. Then I guess we'd better make sure Preston pays more than we do. Something that might have been approval flickered across Nikolai's face. Good. Because we're about to take the first step, and it's going to require you to do something that will cross a line you can't uncross. Catherine thought about her father, about the last time she'd seen him alive, the way he'd told her to never compromise on foundations, because everything else depended on getting that part right. She thought about Jake in a hospital bed, about 800 families who would die if someone didn't stop Preston Holbrook, about the kind of person she'd have to become to survive what came next. What do you need me to do? Nikolai pulled out his phone, brought up a file that showed architectural drawings Catherine recognized as her own work. The Millennium Tower's blueprints. Your signature is on these documents. Preston forged them, but as far as the city is concerned, you're the engineer of record, which means you have legal standing to file complaints, request inspections, halt construction if you can prove the designs don't meet code. But Preston controls the inspectors. Not all of them. Nikolai zoomed in on a name highlighted in the file. Building Inspector Marcus Kane, 48 years old, 28 years with the city, former Navy SEAL. Lost his partner in a construction accident 5 years ago that was ruled an equipment failure but never felt right to him. He's been looking for proof that Chicago's building department is corrupt. You're about to give him that proof. And then what? We go to the media, expose Preston, hope that public pressure is enough to stop him. Then we extract Kane and everyone he cares about before Preston's people eliminate the threat. Nikolai's voice carried the weight of experience. You don't expose a conspiracy this deep without expecting violent pushback. Kane will need protection. His family will need protection. And you'll need to be prepared for what happens when Preston realizes you're not just running, you're fighting back. Catherine moved to the windows, looked out at Chicago spreading beneath them in the morning light. The city looked clean from this height, ordered and logical, each building a testament to human ambition and engineering excellence. But she knew the truth now. Knew that beneath the surface, in the foundations and frameworks that most people never saw, corruption had eaten away at structural integrity until half the skyline was a lie waiting to collapse. When do we start? Now, Nikolai was already moving toward the elevator. Kane's shift starts at 7. We have 90 minutes to intercept him before he gets to the office, before Preston's people can warn him that the missing bride might try to make contact. You'll have one chance to convince him, one chance to show him evidence that will make him risk everything he's built to expose the truth. And if he doesn't believe me? Then we move to Plan B. Nikolai's smile was sharp as a knife edge. But trust me, Catherine, once Marcus Kane sees what you have to show him, he'll believe you. Men like Kane, they spend their whole lives looking for a reason to do the right thing. You're about to give him that reason. The drive to Marcus Kane's house took them through neighborhoods that showed a different side of Chicago than the pristine downtown Catherine knew. Working-class streets, where houses had been built in the 50s and 60s, before planned obsolescence became a business model, structures designed to last, because the people who built them took pride in their work. Kane lived in a modest bungalow in a suburb called Oak Lawn, the kind of place where kids still played in front yards and neighbors knew each other's names. Nikolai parked 2 blocks away, handed Catherine a folder thick with documentation. Everything you need is in there, he said. Original blueprints versus what was filed with the city. Material specifications versus what was actually ordered. Financial records showing the money trail. Make him understand that this isn't just about corruption. This is about people dying because someone decided profit mattered more than safety. You're not coming with me. Nikolai's smile was grim. Marcus Kane is former military. He sees a known criminal approaching his house. He'll assume it's a threat and react accordingly. But a young woman, desperate and scared, asking for help, that's a conversation he'll have. Just remember, you have about 10 minutes before Preston's people realize where you are and converge on this location. Make them count. Catherine took the folder, climbed out of the Merceds into morning air that smelled like cut grass and coffee, and normalcy so profound it felt like a lie. She walked toward Kane's house with the folder clutched against her chest like armor, knowing that what she was about to do would either save lives or get her killed, possibly both. The man who answered the door looked exactly like what Catherine had expected from Nikolai's description. 48 years old, built like someone who'd spent decades staying in fighting shape, eyes that assessed threats with automatic efficiency. He was holding a coffee mug in one hand, wearing jeans and a Navy SEAL t-shirt that had seen better days, and looking at Catherine with the kind of suspicion that came from 28 years of dealing with people who wanted favors or special treatment. Marcus Kane, her voice came out steadier than she felt. My name is Catherine Reeves. I'm a structural engineer, and I need about 8 minutes of your time to show you proof that half the buildings in Chicago are death traps waiting to collapse. Kane's expression didn't change, but Catherine saw the micro-calculations happening behind his eyes, threat assessment running through trained neural pathways. You're the missing bride. The one Preston Holbrook reported kidnapped. I wasn't kidnapped. I ran. Because I discovered that Preston murdered my father 11 years ago to cover up construction fraud, and he was planning to do the same to me as soon as the honeymoon paperwork was signed. That's quite an accusation. It's quite a folder of evidence. Catherine held it up. Building permits filed with forged engineer signatures. Material substitution records showing substandard concrete and steel. Financial trails proving systematic fraud across 7 major developments. And structural analysis proving that all of it is going to fail within the next decade, killing thousands of people unless someone stops it. Kane studied her for a long moment, and Catherine could see the war happening in his expression. The part of him that was a by-the-book inspector who'd spent 3 decades following procedures, versus the part that had lost a partner to what everyone said was an accident but never felt right. The part that wanted to believe the system worked, versus the part that knew better. You've got 5 minutes, he said, stepping aside to let her in. After that, I'm calling this in to my supervisor. Your supervisor is on Preston Holbrook's payroll. Catherine moved into the house, spread the folder's contents across Kane's kitchen table. $200,000 deposited into his account over the past 3 years through a shell corporation that traces back to Holbrook Development. You call him, you're dead within the hour. Kane's expression went very still, the kind of stillness that came right before violence or revelation. Catherine couldn't tell which. She started laying out documents with the precision of a structural analysis, each piece of evidence a load-bearing element in the case she was building. This is my father's signature on approval documents for the Millennium Towers Foundation work. Dated April 15, 2013. 2 weeks before he died in what everyone said was a construction accident. Catherine pointed to the date stamp, except the Millennium Towers project wasn't even conceived until 2022. This signature is forged, and the foundation specifications it approves would create a structure that will collapse within 7 years of completion. Kane picked up the document, studied it with the kind of attention to detail that separated good inspectors from great ones. The concrete compression values are wrong. This wouldn't support a 10-story building, let alone 42. Exactly. Catherine pulled out another sheet, and this is the material order for the actual concrete that was delivered to the site. 25% Portland cement instead of the specified 40%. Aggregate composition that doesn't meet ASTM standards. Steel reinforcement bar that's grade 40 instead of grade 60. Every single element designed to pass initial inspection, but fail catastrophically under sustained load and environmental stress. Kane's hands tightened on the document. How many buildings? 7 confirmed. Catherine's voice was steady, engineer delivering a technical report, even though her stomach was churning with the implications. Millennium Towers is the flagship, but there are 6 others in various stages of construction. Combined occupancy of approximately 4,000 people, all of them living in structures that are going to collapse. And you're sure about this? Kane looked up, and Catherine saw something in his eyes that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of rage. Because if you're wrong, if this is some kind of scam or revenge play, you'll destroy a lot of lives, including your own. I'm an MIT-trained structural engineer with 6 years of experience analyzing building integrity. Catherine met his gaze without flinching. I've run the calculations 17 times. I've stress-tested every assumption. I've verified material properties against laboratory standards. These buildings are going to fail. The only question is whether it happens with people inside or after we've evacuated them. The sound of a car engine outside made them both turn. Nikolai's voice came through the earpiece Catherine had forgotten she was wearing, small and urgent. 2 vehicles approaching. Hallbrook Development Security. You have about 90 seconds before they reach the house. Kane heard it too, saw Catherine's expression change. You're not alone. Who's outside? Someone who wants Preston Hallbrook destroyed as much as you do. Catherine started gathering documents. Someone who can protect you and your family while we expose this conspiracy. But we need to leave now, or we're all going to die in your kitchen while Preston's people make it look like a home invasion. Kane moved with the speed of someone whose military training never really left. He grabbed a go bag from the hall closet, the kind of emergency kit that suggested he'd always known this day might come, pulled out his phone to make a call. Don't, Catherine said. Everyone you call is either compromised or about to become a target. Preston has the entire building department under surveillance. The moment you reach out to anyone official, they'll know where you are. Then what the hell am I supposed to do? Trust a runaway bride and whoever she's got waiting outside? Trust the evidence. Catherine pointed to the documents spread across his table. Trust that your partner didn't die in an accident. Trust that the system you've spent 30 years believing in has failed, and the only way to fix it is from the outside. The sound of car doors slamming, footsteps on the walkway, voices coordinating approach vectors with the efficiency of trained operators. Kane looked at the evidence, looked at Catherine, looked at the life he'd built in this house over decades of honest work and careful routine. Then he made the choice that would define everything that came after. Back door, he said, grabbing the documents and shoving them into his go bag. Through the yard, over the fence to the alley. Move. They ran like Catherine had run the night before, except this time she wasn't alone, wasn't just desperate, was part of something that might actually have a chance of succeeding if they survived the next 5 minutes. The backyard was small, well-maintained, the fence high enough to be a challenge but not impossible. Kane went over first with the ease of someone who'd done obstacle courses in his sleep, turned to help Catherine, pulled her across just as the sound of breaking glass came from inside the house. The Mercedes was idling at the alley entrance, Nikolai behind the wheel looking calm as death. Kane hesitated for maybe half a second, recognition and calculation warring in his expression, then made the same choice Catherine had made and climbed into the back seat beside her. Nikolai drove like he'd mapped every escape route in Chicago, smooth and fast without drawing attention, taking turns that seemed random but clearly weren't. Behind them, Catherine could hear sirens starting to wail, Preston's people calling in backup or maybe just creating chaos to cover their own failure. Marcus Kane, Nikolai said without turning around. 48 years old, former Navy SEAL, 28 years as a building inspector, Lost your partner David Morrison in a crane accident that was ruled equipment failure but never investigated properly. Welcome to the war. Kane's hand moved toward the weapon Catherine hadn't noticed he'd grabbed from his go bag. Who the hell are you? Someone with the resources to keep you alive long enough to expose Preston Holbrook and everyone connected to him. Nikolai took another turn, heading toward the highway. And before you consider shooting me in a moving vehicle, consider that Catherine just handed you evidence of the biggest construction fraud case in Chicago history. Evidence that will get you killed if you try to use it through official channels. Evidence that I can help you leverage into actual justice instead of another cover-up. Kane looked at Catherine. This is who you're trusting, a criminal. This is who I'm using to stay alive long enough to stop Preston from killing 4,000 people. Catherine's voice carried an edge she hadn't known she possessed. You can join us, or you can go back to your house and wait for Holbrook's people to make your death look like a burglary gone wrong. Those are your options. The car filled with silence except for the sound of traffic and the distant wail of sirens. Catherine watched Kane process his choices, watched a good man realize that the system he'd believed in had failed, that the only path to justice required walking through fire with people he'd spent his career trying to put away. What's the plan? Kane finally asked, and the question was surrender and commitment wrapped together. Nikolai's smile in the rearview mirror was sharp as a verdict. The plan is we turn Preston Holbrook's weapons against him. We use his corruption to expose the consortium. We make him choose between destroying himself or watching everything he built collapse around him. And we do it before the council meeting tomorrow night, where my own organization votes on whether to eliminate me for being too weak to handle the situation. Catherine looked out the window as Chicago flowed past, each building now a question mark in her mind, each structure potentially hiding the same kind of fraud that had killed her father and would kill thousands more if they failed. She'd gone from bride to fugitive to conspirator in less than 24 hours, crossed lines she'd never imagined crossing, allied with criminals to fight a monster who hid behind the law. The mathematics had become impossible to calculate. Too many variables, too many unknown forces, too many ways this could end in blood and rubble and regret. But she was committed now. They all were. Kane with his evidence and his dead partner's ghost. Nikolai with his organization fracturing around him. Catherine with her engineering expertise and her father's murdered legacy. Tomorrow night would determine whether they destroyed Preston Holbrook or whether Preston destroyed them. Whether justice was possible in a city this corrupt. Whether good people could win by using bad methods against worse enemies. Catherine didn't know the answer, wasn't sure anyone did. But she was going to find out. One way or another. The Merceds merged onto the highway, heading toward whatever came next, and Chicago fell away behind them like a promise that had never been kept, like a dream that had turned into a nightmare, like a city built on foundations that were crumbling, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. The war had begun, and there was no going back. This content is entirely fictional and does not promote violence, organized crime, or illegal activities. This story reflects the tragic consequences of involvement in the criminal world and the terrible price paid for illegitimate power. The safe house Nikolai brought them to was nothing like the penthouse. This was utilitarian, industrial, a converted warehouse in Gary, Indiana that smelled like motor oil and old concrete. The kind of place where serious work happened away from eyes that asked too many questions. Marcus Kane, 48 years old and built like someone who'd never stopped being a Navy SEAL, looked around the space with the tactical assessment of someone whose military training never really switched off, cataloging exits and sight lines and potential defensive positions. Catherine understood the impulse. 24 hours ago, she'd been preparing for a wedding. Now she was standing in a criminal's warehouse, planning how to destroy a man who'd killed her father and was trying to kill thousands more. The mathematics of her life had shifted so completely that she wasn't sure she'd ever find equilibrium again. Nikolai's tech specialist was already there, a thin man in his 30s who introduced himself as Yuri and immediately began setting up computer equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything Catherine had seen outside of MIT's engineering labs. Screens flickered to life showing security feeds, satellite imagery, network traffic that Catherine recognized as illegal surveillance on a scale that should have terrified her, but somehow just felt like another tool in a toolbox she was learning to use. "We have 18 hours until the council meeting," Nikolai said, spreading a map of Chicago across a table that looked like it had seen decades of planning sessions just like this. "After that, either I convince the Bratva that my way works or Irina takes control and starts a war that will burn this city down." And Preston, Kane's voice carried the flat affect of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with criminals to be impressed by their drama. "What's his timeline?" "Preston doesn't know we have you yet." Nikolai pointed to a red circle on the map, "but he will within the next few hours. He has people in the police department who'll report that you're missing, that your house was breached. He'll assume you're either dead or you've joined forces with someone who can protect you. Either way, he'll accelerate his plans." Catherine moved closer to the table, studied the map with an engineer's eye for patterns and structure. 7 buildings marked in different colors, each one a development project in various stages of construction. 7 death traps waiting to fail. 7 mass graves that Preston Holbrook had designed with the precision of an architect and the morality of a serial killer. "What are we looking at?" she asked, because understanding the terrain was the first step in any structural analysis. Yuri pulled up files on the screens, construction timelines and permit approvals and financial records that painted a picture of systematic fraud operating at industrial scale. Millennium Towers is the flagship, but the other 6 are just as compromised. Combined, we're looking at 4,200 residential units, 600 commercial spaces, and an estimated daily population of 15,000 people once they're fully occupied. 15,000 people living and working in buildings designed to collapse. Kane's voice was quiet, but Catherine heard the rage underneath it, the professional betrayal of a man who'd spent his career trying to keep people safe, only to discover the system was rigged against him from the start. How long until first failure? Catherine pulled up the structural analysis she'd run 3 nights ago when she'd still been naive enough to think evidence mattered more than power. Based on material degradation rates, environmental stress factors, and the specific failure modes engineered into each design, we're looking at a cascade timeline. First building fails in approximately 6 years, but once one goes down, the lawsuits and inspections will reveal the pattern. Preston's counting on insurance payouts and reconstruction contracts to turn the disasters into profit centers. And the people who die? Kane looked at Nikolai. The families crushed when these buildings pancake. They're just acceptable losses in his business model. Preston Holbrook doesn't think in terms of people. Nikolai's voice carried the weight of experience with men like Holbrook, predators who'd learned to see human beings as numbers on spreadsheets. He thinks in terms of return on investment, risk versus reward, cost-benefit analysis that factors in the price of killing you if you become a problem, but never considers the value of keeping you alive. The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Catherine realized she was listening to one criminal explain another's psychology with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a tumor. There was no moral superiority in Nikolai's tone, just recognition of a pattern he'd probably seen dozens of times in his own organization. So what's the play? Kane pulled out the documents Catherine had given him, spread them across the table next to the map. We have evidence of fraud, murder, conspiracy. We have material specifications that prove criminal negligence. We have enough here to put Preston away for life. But you're saying we can't go through official channels. Because official channels are compromised at every level. Yuri brought up a network diagram that showed connections between Preston's shell companies and various city and federal officials. 3 FBI agents on direct payroll. 7 judges who have received campaign contributions that trace back to Holbrook Development. 14 city inspectors whose mortgage payments are made by companies Preston controls. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed, just not for people like us. Then we break the system. Catherine heard herself say it before she'd fully formed the thought, engineers' instinct recognizing that sometimes the only solution to a structural failure was controlled demolition and rebuild. We don't try to work within the rules Preston's rigged. We force him into a position where he has to expose himself. Nikolai turned toward her, and Catherine saw something that might have been respect in his expression. What did you have in mind? We use the one thing Preston can't control, public attention. Catherine pointed to the Millennium Tower's location on the map. This is his flagship project, the one that's supposed to cement his reputation as Chicago's premier developer. Grand opening scheduled for 6 months from now with the mayor, senators, half the city council attending. Preston's staked his entire political future on this building being a success. So we make sure it's a very public failure. Kane's military mind was already running the tactical implications. Force an emergency inspection before the opening. Get media coverage. Make it impossible for the corrupt inspectors to bury the evidence. Except we can't just call for an inspection. Nikolai shook his head. The building department won't move without cause, and Preston's people will block any official complaints before they gain traction. Catherine felt the solution crystallizing in her mind, engineering logic applied to a criminal problem. Then we create the cause. We don't wait for the building to fail naturally. We accelerate the timeline. The room went quiet. Even Yuri stopped typing, turned to look at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. You want to sabotage the building? Kane's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone who just heard a line about to be crossed. Make it fail on purpose. Not fail. Catherine moved to one of Yuri's computers, pulled up the structural drawings she'd memorized during sleepless nights at Preston's office. Show visible stress. Cosmetic damage significant enough to trigger mandatory inspection, but not catastrophic enough to hurt anyone. The building's still under construction. Occupancy is 0. We create evidence of structural failure that can't be ignored or covered up. And how exactly do we do that without access to the site? Nikolai's question carried genuine curiosity, the interest of someone who'd spent a lifetime solving impossible problems. We don't need access to the site. Catherine zoomed in on the foundation details, the part of the structure that Preston had compromised most egregiously. We need access to the concrete supplier. The trucks that pour the foundation mix are computerized now, GPS-tracked mixture ratios controlled by digital systems. Systems that Yuri can hack. The tech specialist's expression shifted from skepticism to understanding. You want me to alter the next concrete delivery? Increase the water-cement ratio beyond acceptable parameters. The foundation will cure with visible cracks, spalling, evidence of substandard materials that will force emergency inspection. Exactly. And when the inspectors come, when the media starts asking questions, we make sure they have access to the real documents. Catherine tapped the folder Kane had brought. The evidence that this isn't an accident or contractor error. This is systematic fraud that Preston Holbrook has been perpetrating for years. Nikolai studied the map, the screens, the evidence spread across the table. It's risky. If we tip our hand too early, Preston will know we're coming. He'll have time to fabricate counter-evidence, discredit our sources, maybe even accelerate his timeline for eliminating us. Then we don't give him time. Kane's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd made harder decisions in harder places. We hit him tonight. Yuri compromises the concrete delivery for tomorrow morning's pour. We leak the inspection evidence to media simultaneously. By the time Preston realizes what's happening, the story's already breaking and he's playing defense instead of offense. And the council meeting. Catherine looked at Nikolai. Your sister's trying to overthrow you. We're asking you to commit to an operation that might not pay off before she makes her move. The council meeting is exactly why this has to work. Nikolai's smile was sharp as broken glass. Irina wants to prove I'm weak, that my methods don't produce results. I show up tomorrow night with Preston Holbrook exposed and the consortium in chaos. I prove that strategy beats violence. I prove that the new way works. Or you show up with nothing and she takes control of the Bratva. Kane wasn't sugar-coating it, just stating facts the way military officers did when lives were on the line. And then what? She starts a war with the Irish and Italians, Chicago turns into a conflict zone, and we all die in the crossfire. Then we'd better make sure I have something to show. Nikolai turned to Yuri. Can you do it? Hack the concrete supplier's systems, alter tomorrow's delivery without leaving a trail. The tech specialist was already typing, screens filling with code and network diagrams and security protocols. Give me 4 hours. Maybe less if their firewalls are as outdated as most construction companies. Catherine watched the plan take shape, watched criminals and a corrupt inspector, and a desperate engineer come together to do something that might save lives or might just get them all killed. The mathematics were still impossible to calculate. Too many variables, too many ways this could fail. But sometimes you had to trust the foundation even when you couldn't see all the way to the top of the structure. I'll need to be there, she said, at the site when the inspection happens. They'll have questions about the structural analysis, about how to interpret the failure patterns. Questions only the engineer of record can answer. Too dangerous. Nikolai shook his head. Preston will have people watching the site. You show up, you're in danger before you make it through the front gate. Not if I show up with FBI protection. Catherine pulled out her phone, looked at the contact information for the one person who might still believe her. Agent Sarah Lynn. She interviewed me 6 months ago as part of a background check for Preston's federal contracts. She seemed like someone who actually cared about getting it right. You think one FBI agent can protect you from Preston's entire network? Kane's skepticism was professional, tactical assessment of odds that didn't look good. I think one honest FBI agent who sees evidence of the biggest construction fraud case in Illinois history might be willing to put her career on the line for something that matters. Catherine met Kane's eyes, the same way you did when you got in Nikolai's car this morning. Fair point. Yuri, can you get me a secure line to Agent Lynn's direct number? Catherine was already thinking through the conversation. How to explain everything without sounding insane. How to convince a federal agent that working with a Russian crime boss was the only way to stop a mass casualty event. Already pulling her file, Yuri's fingers flew across the keyboard. Sarah Lynn, 39 years old, 15 years with the Bureau, specialized in white-collar crime and organized fraud. Her last 3 cases were all construction-related. Looks like she's been building toward something big. The screen filled with Agent Lynn's case files, and Catherine felt something click into place. This wasn't random. Lynn had been investigating Preston or someone connected to him, building a case the same way Catherine had been building her evidence. 2 parallel tracks that were about to converge. Get her on the phone, Catherine said, and pray she's as honest as her file suggests. The call took 17 minutes to set up, routed through enough proxy servers that Yuri guaranteed it couldn't be traced. When Lynn's voice finally came through the speaker, it carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been working too many hours on cases that never seemed to close. "This is Lynn. Who am I speaking with?" "Agent Lynn, my name is Catherine Reeves. I'm the structural engineer who was reported kidnapped yesterday by Preston Holbrook. I need you to know that I wasn't kidnapped. I ran because I discovered evidence that Preston murdered my father and is currently building 7 structures that will collapse and kill thousands of people within the next decade." Silence on the line. Catherine could almost hear the calculations happening. The FBI training that said this was probably a hoax or a setup, fighting against the instinct that said nobody made up a story this specific unless they had something real. "Ms. Reeves, I'm going to need you to come into the field office. Make an official statement." "I can't do that. Your office has agents on Preston's payroll. I come in, I'm in serious danger before I finish the statement. But I can give you evidence. Documentation that proves systematic construction, fraud, material substitution, forged engineering approvals, financial records showing money laundering through shell corporations. Everything you'd need to get warrants and freeze his operations before anyone else is harmed." Another pause. "And why would you trust me with this evidence?" "Because your case file shows you've been investigating construction fraud for 3 years. Because every contractor you've gone after has walked on technicalities or had charges dropped by prosecutors who suddenly developed memory problems. Because you're the only person in the FBI who seems to give a damn that the system is rigged." Lynn's exhale was audible through the speaker. "Where did you get my case file?" "From someone who has the resources to keep me alive long enough to expose Preston Holbrook. Someone you're going to have a lot of questions about, but who right now is the only reason this evidence exists at all. You're working with organized crime." Lynn's voice went flat, professional distance replacing the human interest. "Whatever evidence you have, it's inadmissible if it came from criminal sources." The evidence came from Preston's own files, from city records that are public domain, from engineering analysis that any qualified structural engineer could verify. Catherine's voice stayed steady, engineer explaining facts to someone who needed to understand the math. "The only thing that came from criminal sources is the protection that kept me alive long enough to compile it all." "And what do you want from me?" "Tomorrow morning, Millennium Towers construction site is going to show visible signs of structural failure. Emergency inspection will be mandatory. I need you there to make sure the inspectors who show up aren't on Preston's payroll. I need you to secure the site and the evidence before he can make it disappear." You're asking me to commit federal resources based on the word of a woman who's currently a fugitive. I'm asking you to do your job. Catherine's tone sharpened. I'm asking you to remember why you joined the FBI. I'm asking you to consider that maybe the reason your cases keep falling apart isn't because you're doing something wrong. It's because the system has been corrupted from the inside. And I'm asking you to be at that construction site tomorrow morning with enough agents you trust to make sure the truth doesn't get buried one more time. The silence stretched so long that Catherine thought Lynn might have hung up. Then the agent's voice came back, quieter, carrying a weight that spoke of too many cases that went nowhere, too many criminals who walked free. "What time?" "Foundation pour starts at 6 a.m. Structural issues will be visible within 3 hours as the concrete cures." Catherine checked her notes. "By 9 a.m., the site supervisor will have to call it in or risk criminal liability. That's when you need to be there. That's when we force this into the open." "And if you're wrong, if this is some elaborate setup, then you've wasted a morning and I've guaranteed my own end." Catherine looked around the warehouse, at Nikolai and Kane and Yuri, at the unlikely alliance that had formed around a shared goal of stopping something monstrous. "But I'm not wrong, Agent Lynn, and I think you know that. I think you've known for years that something was fundamentally broken in Chicago's construction industry, and now you have a chance to prove it. Send me the evidence. Lynn's voice carried resignation and determination in equal measure. Everything you have. I'll review it tonight. If it's solid, I'll be there tomorrow. And Ms. Reeves, if you're lying to me, if this is some kind of game, I will dedicate the rest of my career to making sure you face serious consequences. Fair enough. The call ended. Catherine looked at the men around her, criminals and traitors and broken idealists all betting on the same impossible outcome. Yuri was already transferring files to a secure server that Lynn could access. Kane was reviewing tactical approaches to the construction site, planning what to do if Preston's people showed up armed. Nikolai was studying the map, with the expression of a general watching pieces move into position for a battle that would determine more than just one war. It's done, Catherine said, and felt the weight of commitment settle onto her shoulders like the load-bearing stress of a structure under more pressure than it was designed to handle. Tomorrow morning, we find out if we're heroes or if we just signed our own end. Sometimes, Nikolai said quietly, those two things are the same. The night passed in preparation and waiting, two activities that Catherine had learned often felt identical. Yuri worked his digital magic, infiltrating the concrete supplier's systems with the casual expertise of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. Kane made calls to contacts he still had in law enforcement, people he trusted enough to warn that tomorrow might get ugly. Nikolai coordinated with his own people, setting up security perimeters and escape routes and contingency plans for scenarios Catherine didn't want to think about too carefully. She spent the hours reviewing her structural analysis one more time, making sure every calculation was perfect, every conclusion unassailable. Because tomorrow she'd be standing in front of inspectors and federal agents and possibly the media, and there could be no mistakes, no uncertainties, no room for Preston's lawyers to find loopholes in her mathematics. Dawn came with the kind of gray light that matched Catherine's mood, uncertain and cold, and carrying the promise of rain. They drove to the Millennium Towers site in separate vehicles, operational security that Nikolai insisted on. Catherine rode with Kane, who'd switched from inspector to bodyguard without seeming to notice the transition. The construction site was already active when they arrived. Concrete trucks lined up like soldiers waiting for deployment, workers moving with the efficient choreography of a project on schedule and under budget. Catherine knew the truth beneath that appearance. Every cubic yard of concrete in those trucks was compromised, deliberately sabotaged by Yuri's midnight hacking to create a mixture that would cure with obvious defects. They parked 2 blocks away, watched through binoculars as the first truck began its pour at exactly 6 a.m. Catherine checked her phone obsessively, waiting for the message from Yuri that would confirm the sabotage had worked, that they hadn't just committed a federal crime for nothing. The text came at 6:47 a.m. Mixture altered. Water-cement ratio increased by 18%. Aggregate distribution modified. You should see surface cracking within 90 minutes of pour completion. Catherine showed the message to Kane, who nodded with the grim satisfaction of someone watching a plan come together. Now we wait for the failure, and hope Lynn shows up before Preston's people figure out what's happening. The next 2 hours felt like geological time, slow and heavy and inevitable. Catherine watched the concrete pour progress, watched workers smooth and finish the surface, watched the gray mass begin its transformation from liquid to solid, chemical reactions proceeding exactly as her engineering training predicted they would. At 8:32 a.m., the first cracks appeared. Hairline fractures spreading across the surface like lightning frozen in stone, exactly the pattern Catherine had calculated would emerge from concrete with excessive water content and improper aggregate distribution. The site supervisor noticed within minutes, his body language shifting from routine oversight to professional alarm. He made the call at 8:41 a.m. Catherine could see him on the phone, gesturing at the cracked concrete, his face showing the kind of stress that came from realizing something had gone catastrophically wrong on your watch. Within 15 minutes, 3 building inspectors arrived, moving with the urgency of people who knew they were looking at a career-defining moment. And right behind them, exactly on schedule, came Agent Sarah Lynn. She arrived in a convoy of black SUVs that screamed federal authority. 6 agents in FBI windbreakers fanning out across the site with the coordination of a tactical insertion. Lynn herself moved like someone who'd been waiting for this moment, sharp-eyed and focused, showing her badge to the site supervisor and taking control of the scene with the kind of authority that didn't invite argument. "That's our cue." Kane started the car. "You ready for this?" Catherine took a breath, thought about her father, about Jake recovering in Michigan, about 15,000 people who would live or die based on whether she could make this work. "As ready as I'll ever be." They approached the site on foot, Catherine carrying the folder of evidence like a shield, Kane moving beside her with the protective awareness of someone trained to identify threats before they materialized. The FBI agents clocked them immediately, hands moving toward weapons until Lynn called out. "Stand down. These are witnesses." Catherine met Lynn's eyes across the construction site, saw assessment and suspicion, and something that might have been hope. The agent was shorter than Catherine had imagined, compact and muscular, with the kind of face that had learned not to show emotion as a professional survival skill. "Ms. Reeves," Lynn gestured toward the cracked foundation. "You want to explain what I'm looking at?" "Structural failure caused by substandard concrete mixture." Catherine moved to the edge of the pour, knelt to examine the cracks with professional detachment. Water-cement ratio approximately 18% above specification. Aggregate distribution inconsistent with approved mix design. Curing temperature and humidity not properly controlled. "This foundation is compromised and will need to be removed and re-poured." One of the building inspectors, a man in his 50s with the defensive posture of someone who knew he was being implicated, stepped forward. "This is the first pour that's shown any issues. Everything else on this site has been perfect. Everything else on this site has been covering up the same fraud." Catherine stood, handed the folder to Lynn. "These are the original structural specifications signed by my father 11 years ago, except my father died 2 weeks before these documents were supposedly created. The signature is forged. The engineering approvals are fabricated. And every single material specification has been altered to substitute substandard components that will cause progressive failure within 7 years of occupancy." Lynn opened the folder, started reading with the intensity of someone who'd been chasing this kind of evidence for years. The building inspectors exchanged glances that confirmed everything Catherine suspected about their involvement. The site supervisor looked like he was calculating how quickly he could disappear before the arrests started. "This is all circumstantial." The older inspector's voice carried desperation. "Allegations from a woman who's been reported as kidnapped and potentially coerced." "Then let's make it concrete." Catherine pulled out her phone, brought up the files Yuri had compiled. "Financial records showing payment from Hallbrook Development shell companies to your personal accounts over the past 4 years, totaling $630,000. Email correspondence between you and Preston's construction managers, coordinating which inspections to pass regardless of actual code compliance. And before you claim those records are fabricated, Agent Lynn's tech team is going to find the same files on servers that Hallbrook Development controls." Lynn was already signaling to her agents, phones coming out, warrants being prepared with the efficiency of people who'd done this dance before. The building inspectors realized simultaneously that they were looking at federal prison time, and the older one made the calculation that cooperation might reduce his sentence. Preston Holbrook gave us lists, he said, voice cracking. Buildings to pass, inspections to delay, complaints to bury. Said it was just helping move projects through red tape faster. We didn't know people would be harmed. You knew the concrete was substandard. Catherine's voice was ice. You knew the steel reinforcement was inadequate. You knew the foundation work violated every safety code in the International Building Code. You chose to take the money and ignore what it meant. The inspector had no answer for that. Neither did his colleagues, who were being separated and read their rights by FBI agents who'd clearly been briefed on exactly what questions to ask. The site supervisor was cooperating fully, providing access to construction logs and material delivery records and communications with Holbrook Development that documented the entire conspiracy. Catherine watched it unfold with the strange detachment of someone who'd spent so much energy getting to this moment that she'd forgotten to plan for what came after. Justice was happening. The system was finally working the way it was supposed to, and all she could think about was whether Preston Holbrook was watching this on security feeds somewhere, calculating his next move. Agent Lynn approached, holding the folder like it was evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. "This is solid," she said. "Better than solid. This is the kind of documentation that ends careers and sends people to prison for decades. But I need to know where it came from. All of it. Because if this came from illegal surveillance or criminal conspiracy, my case falls apart in court." It came from Preston's own files. Catherine met Lynn's gaze without flinching. Files I accessed while I was engaged to him, while I had legitimate reason to be in his office reviewing project documents. Everything else is public record, city filings, material purchase orders, engineering certifications. The only thing that required criminal assistance was staying alive long enough to compile it. And the concrete sabotage this morning. Lynn's voice was carefully neutral. The mixture alteration that created these very convenient cracks was an acceleration of failure that would have happened naturally within 18 months of full occupancy. Catherine's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd run the calculations. I didn't create a problem that didn't exist. I just made it visible before people started living in a death trap. Lynn studied her for a long moment, and Catherine could see the war happening behind the agent's eyes. The part that was a by-the-book federal officer who didn't bend rules, versus the part that had spent 15 years watching criminals walk free because the system was rigged. The part that valued procedure versus the part that valued results. "I'm going to have questions," Lynn finally said. "A lot of questions. About your sources, your timeline, your involvement with individuals who may have facilitated this evidence gathering. But right now, I'm going to secure this site and start building a case against Preston Holbrook that will make sure he never builds another structure in this country. That's all I'm asking for." The site became a controlled chaos of FBI agents and evidence technicians and construction workers being interviewed. Catherine gave her statement 3 separate times to 3 different agents, each one probing for inconsistencies, each one trying to find the holes in her story. But the mathematics held. The evidence was solid. And by noon, warrants were being executed at 7 different Holbrook development properties across Chicago. Kane found her sitting on a concrete barrier at the edge of the site, watching federal agents photograph cracks that proved her father had been murdered for telling the truth. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stopped him." "I delayed him." Catherine's engineer brain was already calculating the appeals, the legal maneuvers, the ways Preston's lawyers would try to dismantle the case. "We proved the fraud. But proving murder is going to be harder. Proving Preston personally ordered my father killed will require evidence we don't have." "Then we find it." Kane settled onto the barrier beside her, and Catherine noticed how comfortable he looked in this role, protector and ally, the kind of man who'd spent a lifetime fighting battles that mattered. Preston's careful, but nobody's perfect. He made mistakes. We just have to find them. Catherine's phone buzzed. A text from Nikolai. Council meeting in 6 hours. Results from your operation are exactly what I needed. Well done. She showed it to Kane, who smiled grimly. Your Russian friend gets to keep his throne. For now. And we get to keep breathing. For now. Catherine pocketed the phone, but this isn't over. Preston's still out there. The consortium still exists, and we just declared war on people who don't forgive or forget. War requires soldiers willing to fight. Kane stood, offered his hand to help Catherine up. You've got me. You've got Agent Lynn whether she admits it yet or not. You've got Nikolai and his resources. That's more than most people have when they go against power like this. Catherine took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. In the distance, news vans were arriving, media alerted to the story of the biggest construction fraud case in Chicago history. By tonight, Preston Holbrook's name would be toxic. By tomorrow, his political future would be destroyed. And within a week, if Lynn worked as fast as Catherine hoped, federal charges would be filed that would put him away for life. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough to make up for her father's murder or the years she'd spent not knowing the truth. But it was justice of a kind, the only kind available in a world where corruption ran so deep that the only way to fight it was from the outside, with weapons that weren't entirely clean but got the job done anyway. Agent Lynn approached again, and this time her expression was less suspicious, more evaluative. You're going to need protection, she said without preamble. Preston has resources, connections, people who won't care that we're building a case against him. Until we have him in custody, you're a target. I'm aware. FBI can provide witness protection, safe houses, new identity, relocation. Catherine thought about Jake, about the life she'd built even if parts of it had been based on lies, about whether she could walk away from Chicago and pretend none of this had happened. No thank you, Agent Lynn. I've spent too long running from things. I think it's time I stood my ground. That's brave. Lynn's smile was sharp, also potentially dangerous. But I respect it. Just know that the offer stands if you change your mind. I appreciate that. Lynn moved away to coordinate with her team, and Catherine pulled out her phone again. Time to check on the other front, the battle she'd been too focused to think about while justice was being served. The text to Nikolai was simple. How did the council meeting go? His response came within seconds. Irina challenged my leadership as expected. I presented evidence of Preston's exposure, the consortium's disruption, the FBI investigation that will dismantle their Chicago operations. Council voted 9-3 to maintain my position. My sister has been removed from her position and exiled from the organization. The Bratva remains under my control. And the cost. 3 council members who supported Irina no longer with us. They couldn't accept the vote. The price of keeping power when people want to take it from you. Catherine stared at the message, at the casual mention of consequences as a business expense, and felt the gulf between her world and Nikolai's stretch into something unbridgeable. She'd worked with him, used his resources, relied on his protection. But she could never forget what he was, what his power was built on, the bodies that paved the road to his version of legitimacy. She typed a response. Thank you for your help. I hope we both got what we needed from this alliance. We did. And Catherine, one more thing. Your brother is recovering well. Full mobility expected within 6 months. He's being transferred to a civilian facility tomorrow under his own name. My protection remains in place until Preston is no longer a threat. Tell Jake I'll see him soon. The phone went quiet. Catherine stood at the construction site that had become a crime scene, watching the sun angle toward late afternoon, watching Chicago's skyline hold steady against weather that threatened rain. Somewhere in that sprawl of steel and glass and concrete, Preston Holbrook was learning that his empire was collapsing. Somewhere, politicians and judges who'd taken his money were calculating how to distance themselves before the indictments came down. Somewhere, the consortium was fracturing, as the three families realized their alliance had been built on the very corruption that was now destroying them. And here, at the foundation of what was supposed to be Preston's masterpiece, Catherine Reeves stood as living proof that sometimes the only way to fix a broken system was to break it completely and start over. Kane approached one more time, and Catherine noticed he was carrying 2 coffee cups from a vendor that had set up to serve the media circus. Thought you might need this. She accepted the coffee gratefully, let the warmth spread through hands that had been cold since yesterday morning. What happens now? Now we wait for Preston to make his move. Kane sipped his own coffee, eyes scanning the perimeter with professional paranoia. Man like that doesn't go down without a fight. He'll try to discredit the evidence, threaten witnesses, maybe even make a run for it if he thinks the case is solid enough. And when he does, we'll be ready. Kane's smile was grim. Agent Lynn knows what she's doing. She's already frozen his accounts, seized his passport, put surveillance on every property he owns. Preston Holbrook's running out of moves. Catherine hoped that was true. Hoped that, for once, justice would be swift and certain instead of delayed and compromised. Hoped that her father could rest knowing his daughter had finished what he started, had exposed the corruption he died trying to reveal. The rain started falling as the sun set, washing Chicago in that temporary way rain always did, giving the city a fresh coat of clean that wouldn't last until morning. Catherine stood in it anyway, letting the water soak through her clothes, feeling something like absolution or maybe just exhaustion. 3 days ago, she'd been a bride walking toward a wedding that would have killed her. Now she was a witness in a federal case, a fugitive who'd worked with criminals, an engineer who'd committed sabotage in service of a greater good. The mathematics of who she'd become were impossible to calculate, variables that didn't fit into any equation she'd learned at MIT. But she was alive. Jake was safe. Preston was finished. And sometimes, when the alternatives were serious harm or compromise, choosing compromise was the only rational solution. Agent Lynn approached through the rain, holding an umbrella that she didn't offer to share. We got him. Preston Holbrook was arrested 20 minutes ago trying to board a private plane to the Cayman Islands, resisting arrest, attempting to flee prosecution. The man's not as smart as he thinks he is. Catherine felt something release in her chest, tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. What happens next? Next comes the trial. Months of depositions and evidence review and legal maneuvering. Lynn's expression was professionally neutral, but Catherine caught a glimpse of satisfaction underneath. But we've got him. The evidence is solid. The inspectors are cooperating. We've seized documents from his office that corroborate everything you provided. Preston Holbrook is going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. And the buildings. Condemned pending full structural review. The city's already started evacuation proceedings for any occupied units. We're looking at the biggest construction fraud case in United States history. Lynn paused, studied Catherine with something that might have been respect. You did that. You stopped a mass casualty event before it happened. Saved lives that will never know they were in danger. I just did the math. Catherine looked back at the cracked foundation, at the evidence of corruption made visible in concrete and steel. My father taught me that cutting corners on buildings was the same as cutting throats. The failures just take longer to bleed out. I made sure the bleeding stopped before people started getting hurt. Your father would be proud. Catherine wasn't sure about that. Wasn't sure Michael Reeves would approve of the methods she'd used, the alliances she'd made, the lines she'd crossed. But she was sure he'd approve of the outcome, and sometimes that had to be enough. The rain continued to fall as the last of the FBI agents packed up their evidence, as the media vans rolled out to file stories that would dominate the news cycle for weeks, as Chicago began the slow process of understanding just how close it had come to a disaster that would have made national headlines for all the wrong reasons. Catherine Reeves stood in the rain and the gathering dark and thought about foundations, about how everything that came after depended on getting that part right, about how her father had died trying to protect the integrity of structures that most people never thought about until they failed. She'd finished his work, had exposed the corruption he'd discovered, had made sure his end meant something beyond tragedy. The mathematics were finally complete, the calculations balanced, the structure would hold. And Catherine Reeves, structural engineer, survivor, reluctant ally to criminals, could finally rest knowing she'd built something that would last. Something true. Something worth the price she'd paid to make it real. The rain washed Chicago clean, and for once, Catherine believed it might actually take.